Hey guys, we're going to start this week a couple classes on Zionism, religious Zionism, what it means to be Jewish and what it means to be Zionist and Jewish, what redemption's about, what the state of Israel is about, how those two work together. So most of these sources you guys will see from a book called Bayom Hahu. I left my copy in the other room, but it's this nice blue sefer with drashot for Moadei Iyar, the holidays of the month of Iyar. Thank you, Max. There's also one drasha we're going to work with from Panecha Avakesh, which is Rav Shagar's drashot from when he was Rosh Yeshiva of a Kotel for a year in 1982. And some of all of these texts have been reprinted in a book that came out last year called Briti Shalom, which is on like the state of Israel, war and peace, left and right, Israeli society, spanning from the 80s to the 2000s, to collected essays on politics and redemption and war and stuff. It's good stuff. We're going to work with Bayom Hahu mostly, some of my favorite texts. Hey Akiva, how you doing? Let's jump right in. One second. Okay, so this first text is from a drasha called Chok ve'ahava, Law and Love, which is focusing on the hitnatkut, the disengagement from Gaza. That's from Yom HaTzmaut, right before the disengagement. And Rav Shagar is really struggling with questions of what is the state of Israel if the state of Israel is going to force Jews out of their homes. The disengagement from Gaza was a moment of real crisis for much of the religious Zionist community here. For many of them, specifically because it meant giving up land, and the state of Israel was giving up some of its land, which it's supposed to have as part of the march toward the Messianic era. For Rav Shagar, the land issue was less the problem and more the forcing Jews out of their homes, like doing violence to Jews and the tearing apart the unity of the nation, and also the idea of the state of Israel is itself a violent force, right? Rav Shagar, we'll see some more pieces on this in the next section of the source sheet, was deeply engaged with Rav Kook's vision of redemption as a time beyond war and violence. So what does it mean for the redemptive state of Israel to be not just participating in, but to be a real source of violence? Something Rav Shagar struggled with very greatly. But this phenomenal drasha of Chok ve'ahava, it's also in the packet of translations I sent last week in the PDF. He has this great discussion of what was Zionism before, what were Jews like before Zionism, and then what has Zionism made us into. And it's going to be very parallel to what you might call, I think, the shift to the land of Israel might be very similar to the shift to America in some ways, that being religious Zionist is very much like being modern Orthodox. But we'll get to that in sources 4 and 5 or so. Let's see. Okay, so this is from Chok ve'ahava. What was the spiritual situation before Rav Kook's teachings? What was the religious Jewishness that we mentioned? What does it mean to have some sort of religious form of being Jewish before Rav Kook and religious Zionism made a way of thinking about religion and Jewish religion that was connected to the land of Israel? Rosenzweig, this is Franz Rosenzweig, German Jewish thinker, who I've almost certainly mentioned before, taught that Jewishness manifests as commitment and being rooted in the covenant, which are the fundamental acts of Judaism. The deepest aspect of what it means to be Jewish is to be committed to the Jewish people, to the Jewish people as a people within history, spanning back in history, going forward, that you're part of something bigger than yourself, and that thing is the Jewish people, which is in relationship with God. Right? So that sense of belonging to something bigger than yourself, and that thing sort of defining you, is the most fundamental part of Judaism. According to this definition, the Jewish exile is when you create a sheltered, ahistorical family space without being concerned for surroundings or engaged in the rules of history. The Jews lack the passionate attachment to things that constitute the primary objects of other historical peoples and nations, attachments that ultimately constitute their vitality and endurance as peoples and nations: land, territory, and architecture, regional and national languages, laws, customs, and institutions. For Rosenzweig, what it means to be a holy people is to be people who lack all of the things that typically define a people. That people are typically defined by the land they live in, by their self-governance, by like making laws that define their own practices, by having a shared language that they speak in their everyday life. And in Galut, Jews had none of those things. Like Hebrew became the language of tefillah and Torah, but not of spoken life. We lived according to the laws of other lands. So we couldn't, help it. We tried as much as possible to govern ourselves, but they were always ultimately in charge, and we were outside our land. Our land was in Galut an object of hope rather than a place we lived. Right? That our land was not the space in which we dwelled. Our land was something we dreamed of, we prayed for. We were defined by this lack that we had, right? The Jews in Galut had none of these things that people typically have, and so they're defined by instead being sort of committed to the idea of having these things and to the God who gave them to us. Their land exists only as a holy land for which they yearn, and their holy language is not their first language, not the language that they speak in their daily lives. Jewishness is bound up and connected only and entirely in itself. What it means to be Jewish is not to be involved in the space around you, right? You know that you could be kicked out of this land the next year. Jewishness is not about building institutions to govern yourself and anyone who might be living in the area with you. Jewishness is about, returning to the same texts Jews have studied throughout our history. The Jew being connected only in himself, the nation in its very existence, creates a twofold relationship with the outside. Other nations and cultures either do not exist from the Jew's perspective, the outside does not enter his horizon at all. Or I left off a passage over here. Or the Jew brings the like you sometimes find the Rambam who brought in Greek philosophy or whatever, but involves a process of almost like giur, right? Ideas that come in become Jewish ideas. There's no ongoing acknowledged relationship with things outside, with the people, with the land, the space outside the Jews. Jews live alone and to themselves. And Shagar talks about this a lot. He talks about like the Haredi society. He calls it a couple places. One place called authentic Haredi society. Another place calls it like rectified Haredi community. That he has this sort of ideal romanticized picture of what it means to be religious. That's what he talks about here as like Judaism before Zionism. But he talks the same way about the Haredi community sort of now in Israel, at least on like an ideal level, is this idea that all you're focused on is this way of life where all you care about is your own culture, specifically Judaism, but you're unaware of other cultures outside yourself. And Rav Shagar acknowledges that, like, for the contemporary Haredi community, that's not the case. They're very aware of what's going on outside themselves, lots of back and forth. They're involved in Israeli politics and Israeli culture. It's just, there is no totally isolated community. But for Rav Shagar, that is a way of thinking about Judaism, right? Maybe Judaism might mean or might have meant at one point in this time being so totally cut off from the outside world that you're not even really aware it's there. That, like, if you ever take note of it, you just forget it as soon as you've turned around, because it's so unimportant to you that all you're concerned with is being a Jew, being part of the Jewish community, being connected to Torah and things like that, being part of the Brit. And that's sort of what Rav Shagar wants to think of as a form of Judaism that's non-Zionist. That's like Judaism before Zionism. The next text is going to start talking about the transition away from that. So before I get there, any questions so far? Okay. This is a great little passage from from Panacha Avakesh. This is drashot from 1982, 1983. It's from a drasha for Yom Ha'atzmaut called Yemot HaMashiach, the days of Mashiach, but it's from a small subsection called Tzionut K'Mahapecha, Zionism as a Revolution. Zionism was unquestionably a revolutionary, even rebellious movement, right? In a sense, the Haredi critique of secular Zionism is correct. Its revolution was not just political, but also spiritual and cultural. It wasn't just trying to get, a like sovereignty for the Jewish people. It also meant to change to spirituality and to the Jewish culture. Rejecting exile. This is in Hebrew, Shlilat Golah. It's a big phrase among secular Zionists, but also, religious Zionists. As he says, it meant first and foremost rejecting the spiritual reality of the exilic Jew, right? Rejecting what it meant to be a Jew in Galut. When the Zionists rejected exile, they rejected the life of the Jewish people in exile. Right? They said, we're not going to live life the way the Jews used to live it. Jews still lived it at that point in time. Undeniably, for most secular Zionists, this meant rejecting Torah and mitzvot, which they identified with the exilic life, with Galut. When the majority of the Jewish people's leaders polemicized against Zionism, they did so because of this rejection, right? When the Gedolei Yisrael were attacking Zionism, they did so because the Zionists hated Torah and mitzvot and said, we don't want to keep Torah and mitzvot anymore, right? They weren't, like, it wasn't a bad thing to critique Zionism. It made sense from a Jewish perspective. Rav Shagar is here, like, very deeply empathizing with what we think of as the Haredi position, right? The position that says Zionism is bad. It's like, right, because Zionism said no more Torah and mitzvot, and that's a reality that religious Zionists have to deal with. What I've said is true beyond secular Zionism as well. Religious Zionism was also a rebellious revolutionary movement. Religious Zionism and Zionism writ large are in this sense the same. They rejected exilic life, which means rejecting the life of Torah and the commandments as it existed in exile. And obviously, Rav Shagar doesn't mean that religious Zionists rejected Torah and mitzvot, because that's what makes them religious Zionists as opposed to secular Zionists. What he means is exactly the question of, like, having a language we speak that is the Hebrew, that's the common tongue of all our people. The idea of building political and social institutions to govern our daily life, our shared political life together, and being part of world politics and being a power on the world stage, both economically and diplomatically, having like a real influence on other people and being influenced by other people. All those are all things that are not just like incidental, that Jews didn't have them before, based on the first source here, Rav Shagar saying those are like the opposite, the exact opposite, what it meant to be Jewish 200 years ago, right? So 200 years ago specifically meant not having anything to do with like real lived national history. That's what Jewishness was about. And now Jewishness could be about something else. And that's, Rav Shagar not saying that's bad, but you have to recognize how revolutionary it was. There's a real shift going on here. Any thoughts, questions so far? Akiva, is everything working? I keep seeing you fiddling with the screen.
Yeah, it's good now. We just couldn't.
Okay,
we had this a little far away, so I just zoomed in.
Okay, cool.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Just wondering, like, how do you think this relates to, like, on one hand, Rav Kook's idea of like Tzviya Yoshua, and also like Rav Shagar's idea of not yet, in a way that it's making it sound like almost a defining character of like religious life in exile was that Tzviya Yoshua, was that we were always expecting something, and once we moved past that to actually living in that, like it fell apart. Like, how do you think those interact with each
other? So I think Rav Kook is a little more complicated in terms of like the different aspects of his thought. He maintains this sense of looking out, like anticipating redemption as something that comes from outside ourselves, but also is willing to talk about like secular Zionism as a really redemptive force. And like the most famous example of this is the speech he gave after Herzl died, where he talked about how anyone who furthers the national like settlement of the Jewish people in the land of Israel and building up the land of Israel has within them a spark of Mashiach ben Yosef. Right? He did not call Herzl Mashiach ben Yosef, but he like essentially implied that there is some aspect of what Herzl was doing that is messianic. And that's true of anyone settling the land, right? So the Rav Kook is also endorsing in a very strong way the idea that we can help bring Mashiach ourselves. So that itself is exactly like that's the revolution that Rav Shagar is talking about. Is a revolution that we can ourselves return ourselves to the land, return ourselves to political life and like vibrant social life, and that's very different from what life was like in the exile. Rav Shagar, as we'll see later on in this source sheet, not today, eventually goes back to that, to the anticipatory model. Wants to go back to the not yet that you mentioned. He thinks that there's issues with thinking we can just bring redemption now. But this is what religious Zionism means, though, on a fundamental level, is moving away from just anticipating redemption to being an active driving force in it. That it's part of, in a sense, the modern shift from God driving history to people driving history. That we have the ability to help bring redemption, and like slightly tangent, but like broader context. That's what the modern state was meant to do, was to create a sort of secular redemption, right? We could, all the things redemption was meant to do in history, to make a good society where everyone was taken care of and everyone was like happy and healthy, was something secular. Like, oh, we don't need God for that. We can just do that ourselves with the state. And the like contemporary remnant of that is called the welfare state. But for religious Zionists, they're like, yeah, that's, God wants us to help be doing that. And you can there's all kinds of different texts from Rav Kook and all of his students, that their students, showing how, like, going back to Tanakh, people were supposed to be involved in this process. But for secular Zionists, it was not a divine process. It was just people doing it. And you'll find the early fathers of secular Zionism talking in explicitly messianic terms about this. That, like, we as the Jewish people can achieve redemption without needing God behind that. And so Rav Shagar is part of that, but also will eventually come around to critiquing that. He doesn't think we're necessarily capable of achieving it on our own, certainly not entirely. Anyone else? Great. Okay, source number 3.
Yeah, I guess just, oh.
Yeah, Max.
Yeah, just on that last point, a class I took first semester in Hebrew, we discussed, somewhat about how the Enlightenment as a whole, almost, if you use different language, almost offered itself as a form of redemption, meaning this idea of everyone has meaning not just redemption in the physical sense of returning to the land, but also like, meaning there's like the spiritual dimension of galut, and that through reason and through the like Enlightenment thought, we would be capable of in a certain sense being able to elevate ourselves further and further, and the modern state being a mechanism for bringing ourselves to a perpetual peace. And I've seen thinkers talk about, Jewish thinkers, I can't think of any to name right now, but talk about how specifically being outside of that alternative form of redemption, by not engaging with the modern state apparatus, like Judaism would be almost saved from going in that route. And I guess I'm just kind of wondering here is to what extent Rav Shagar, like, I guess, identified or empathize with that perspective, that of not wanting to be caught up in modern state as it exists in his time.
So he ends up being pretty sympathetic to it. We'll see later on. He has a lot of critiques of the modern state as a fundamentally sort of violent institution. We called post-liberal critiques of the liberal state. The idea that it's not as simple to say that we can just, get away from violence, that states are in fact always enacting as much violence as they're solving. We'll get there a different day. I want to look at source number 3, at the very least. I'm going to deepen a little bit this idea of Haredi society. Since the Haredi suspension of reality is not ideological suspension. Is that what Haredi society lives, the way that Jews lived once upon a time, is, at least in theory, right? He said that he doesn't necessarily say this is true of Haredi society today, but at least the idea of Haredi society is that it's stepped outside of reality, sort of suspended real life. It does not deny reality and concrete existence. It consciously and intentionally disconnects from them, right? Haredi society doesn't say, oh, like, the modern state isn't happening. There's no Israeli army. There's no wars, whatever. They just like do their own thing, totally separate. This suspension is itself existence, performed not through defensiveness, but through estrangement. The construction of a heterotopic all. Heterotopic is a word Rav Shagar means. That means topia, world, hetero, different. Totally different world. A realm which external reality does not at all enter. We could describe a traditional Jew as someone who lives in a heterotopic whole without any other, since this whole is the entire whole, is its own boundary. This suspension alienates the Haredi Jew from reality. Haredi suspension of reality is built upon the creation of a heterotopic space, which suspends itself from everything around it. Right. So it's about time to go, but that is the idea we're going to contrast with next time. The idea that Judaism, what it means, what it meant before Zionism, certainly, but potentially even now, is somehow closing yourself off to like everything else, right? Think of it like the way we think about Haredi society in contrast, like modern Orthodoxy. Modern Orthodoxy means in some way being engaged with the world. Haredi society then and now means somebody ignoring the world. Any questions before we go? Okay, so then next time we'll pick up with source number 4 and the question of what does it mean to be a religious Zionist and modern Orthodox and stuff. Great, have a great week, you guys. Ready, guys, I'll see you on Thursday.
Thanks so much, Rav.
Absolutely.
Thank you.